Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the JMC Podcast. We spin the jams and spill the tea. And today, we're going to be talking about two new album releases from two bands that this podcast are very fond of. We're going to be talking about the new album from Paramore, their new album, This Is Why. And we're also, of course, going to be talking about the newest album from one of Riley's favorite bands, has an entire video about their whole discography that you absolutely should watch to prep for this if you haven't. The new Yo La Tengo album. We'll be talking about that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great time for music and just a really podcore week this week. I mean, we were spoiled for choice on things we could review as well. A lot of we chose the two most kind of podcore, I think, but there are lots of other massive albums that were stirring a lot of waves this week, and I'll talk a little bit about them in our Now episode in a couple of days' time. But let's kick off with Paramore because we've talked about Yo La Tengo before. I've talked about Yo La Tengo on the podcast before. Actually, we have, because we did do a record club on them, so we'll get to them later. But let's talk about Paramore, because Paramore is a band that we all three of us love, and yet we haven't really had or been afforded the opportunity to shed a lot of words on them yet.
They've been on one of their 18 hiatuses for the past however long.
Well, yeah, well, they've just, I think Haley put out a couple of solo records, one of which we reviewed moderately. So we've been waiting for the return, essentially, because Paramore have kind of, with all the things that they've gone through as a band, and also with, having been around a while as well, and not wanting to run their shtick into the ground, they've kind of graduated into that stage of the career of any kind of established band where it's just one album every 4 or 5 years, and then we'll just, let the dust settle before we come back. And it's a long wait, but they're finally back with This Is Why, which is, I want to say, their 6th album,
yes,
I believe. And yeah, the first since 2017's After Laughter, which itself, it's funny because to me, each of the last 3 Paramore records, including this one, are they're like a pivot of a certain kind, right? Because their first 3 records are, the core establishing Paramore records. Then, of course, they went through, the massive lineup change that led to their basically reforming themselves for 2013's self-titled record, which is still my favorite Paramore record. Then, of course, you had the pivot with 2017's After Laughter into sort of, more sunnier, synthier pop music.
My favorite Paramore album.
Yeah, a lot of people's favorite Paramore record. That record was really well received. And now we're back with This Is Why, which is kind of somewhere in between their last 2 albums. It doesn't necessarily shy away from that more shinier major key direction of After Laughter, but it doesn't also kind of take you to the heavier places that their self-titled album taught you. It's kind of treading a line in between those two things, but also kind of representing something that does feel a little bit fresh and new for Paramore. And Morgan, I want to turn to you at this point as well. You're the most established Paramore stan among us, and you love this band as much as more than life itself, it's fair to say. What do we need?
Yeah.
What do we need to know about Paramore and this album, and what your expectations were for this record, and what your sort of general thoughts are on it now that you've had it for a week to sort of stew?
Even though I would say Brand New Eyes is still my favorite Paramore record, After Laughter was very close behind it. They're both essentially perfect to me, or at least as close to perfect as records get. So naturally, I felt like the band had finally settled into both a lineup that was good for them, and after this hiatus, landed in a mostly good place from everything I can tell. Everybody in the band seems to be in a mostly good place now, which is not common so far, unfortunately. So it was really great, especially at the advent of the first single drop. The title track, I think pretty uniformly, most people who care one way or the other agreed was fantastic. It's both as sort of an interesting twist on what was being done on After Laughter, this sort of more angular dance punky kind of thing that was happening there, and more focused, that was made more focused by This Is Why, sonically speaking.
Yeah. Well, you had like the new wave sound is, I think, a good way of describing After Laughter, because it's just that sort of 80s synthesizer tones and that sort of stuff. And what was so exciting about This Is Why is like you kind of got the remnants of that, but just how rhythmic it was, just how kind of locked into this, post-punk sound, I would even describe it as well, because they've cited bands like Block Party and Interpol, like post-punk revival bands from the 2000s, as being influential on this direction. So I mean, This Is Why, that song, when that came out, I couldn't believe how just completely locked into to a groove it was, because it just wasn't something I was expecting from Paramore coming off the back of their last record. It's still, I think, the best single they've put out since, I don't know, Still Into You, maybe. I am admittedly not as obsessed with After Laughter as everyone else, although I think it's a very good album. But this song just completely set my expectations up, ceiling height. Like I was like, damn, this is like exactly. It's like they're pivoting their sound into something that feels very suited to the kind of stuff I'm nostalgic for. And I still think, I like the album a lot. I still think it's the best song on it. I just can't get enough. I still can't get enough of This Is Why. And I've probably heard it, 40 times now.
Yeah, as someone who is also very big into this sort of post-punk indie thing that happened in the early 2000s and continues to be felt in a myriad of ways now, not to mention television, which is also, if maybe only by being a direct influence on the things that are influencing this album, is still heard here in many ways. Very excited to find that this was the direction that this band was going in, especially considering the strengths of the rhythm section and Taylor York's very particular, almost idiosyncratic knack for making guitar arrangements that I think he's really come into his own in the last 10 years or so, in terms of having a sound that is, while indebted to so many others that came before him, but very particular to him at this point.
Mm. No, I agree. I was really taken with Taylor York's guitar parts on this record, and particularly the way things that he was doing texturally as well, which very much reminded me of a lot of the influences from 2000s indie, which itself is borrowing heavily from 80s new wave and Zolo and all that sort of stuff. I think it comes through really, really strongly on a song like Running Out of Time as well, where he has these little, almost like monotonous guitar parts that he plays that are there purely to kind of emphasize a beat and give this really kind of dancey feel to what is ostensibly, a post-punky rock song. And I love that attribute of what he's doing here. He's just, it adds so much flavor. And Paramore have always been a band that are really great at kind of creating these songs that have instantly, when they start, already have a sense of momentum. And this kind of tight, sort of airtight, sort of no reverb, just you're really stuck into a groove. And they really, really emphasize that on basically, well, not every song here, because some songs are a little bit more stripped back, but most of the core songs here really, really emphasize that kind of airtight, just brittle, but at the same time, really slap in the face tonality to the guitars, and of course the impact of Zach Farrow's drumming too.
It felt like such a clear reinvention of the sound without overhauling everything that made After Laughter break. I think that's sort of where we run into problems on this record, because I do really enjoy This Is Why overall, but it's probably my second least favorite Paramore record. Granted, these things are always subject to change just with the passage of time, but it does feel to me, as a result of a number of circumstances, that Paramore is starting over again here. Where they started over with the self-titled and where they sorted over with After Laughter. They're kind of having to do that again here. And I think it's felt in ways, mostly sonically, on this album, that sort of it make it difficult for me to feel like this is the statement that it should have been. That This Is Why in the news made it feel like it was going to be in the lead up to this album.
I largely find myself feeling like I'm in a very similar spot, because like the most interesting things I have to say about this are the more negative things, even though I don't have a lot bad to say. I think the album's like pretty damn great, all things considered. I think it's really tightly designed. You know, it's only like 30 some minutes, and everything here feels really tightly wound. Nothing feels, you know, kind of extraneous, even though I think, because I'm also, like Riley, a really big fan of the band Self-Titled, I think the band does a good job of, like, when they lean into excess, they do it very well, and when they pare themselves back, they also do it very well. But I do think that the growing pains of their new sonic direction on this album are the most tangibly felt here, just because I feel like their other pivots that they've made are just things that came more naturally to them. This inherently, I feel like, is a much more difficult sound. It's something that's a little bit more like odd to wrap your head around. And, you know, obviously it's a bit more musically adventurous than anything they've ever made. I mean, for as much as I love After Laughter, I feel like that album was, you know, it leaned into a lot of their strengths, but it was largely, like, sonically speaking, very much playing it safe in the kind of throwback that it was, especially in the landscape of music at the time. I feel like a lot of people were kind of leaning into that sort of 80s throwback kind of thing. And I love it. And I think that they did that better than most other bands did. But here it is sort of odd on occasion, because there are moments that really feel like they should hit harder because of how tightly designed this is. You want to feel the impact of every moment, and when it starts off as strongly as it does with This Is Why and The News, which I love both of these songs, I think they're great. This Is Why is just super fun. You got the This Is Why hook, and it's really fun, it's really animated. And you've got The News, and I think these have a really great thematic similarity to them as well, because they're very much about the, you know, the overwhelmingness of modernity in some respects. The News, of course, being them talking about, well, media conglomerates, the news. And honestly, they have one of the more nuanced takes on the subject that I've seen in the last couple of years. I very, very easily, like, I see the news and you see it's like, oh, they're writing about topical stuff, because I haven't gotten enough of that in the last 3.5 years. And no, they actually do it well, and they lean into all their strengths as a band. They don't sacrifice anything on this song, and they still lean into their emotionality. However, there are moments on here that just they really stick out to me as kind of road bumps, just because this is such a tightly packaged albums. The two moments on here that stick out to me are, first of all, the third to last song, Liar. I don't think anything necessarily bad about this song.
What a bad
It's
song.
just it's just not doing anything I feel that's particularly interesting. Like, sonically, I feel like it sounds good. It sounds very pretty. I like the way it sounds, but it really just kind of, you know, just kind of repeats that dreamy hook over and over again. And I just kind of feel like this kind of feels like it maybe would have fit better on After Laughter than it would here. It just kind of feels like it disrupts this album's flow in a very strange way. And I feel like the most, like, the least controversial hot take on this album I have is that I finally encountered a Paramore song that I just kind of straight up don't like, in the form of C'est Comme Ça, which I don't really know what this song's deal is. It's got
Say
that
it
hook.
slaps.
I don't like it very much.
Look, I think it's the weakest song here as well. And I don't think it. I think the issue with it is not. That I find it annoying or anything like that. I just think that it's not very fully formed. It's a nice hook. That doesn't
I have both issues.
It is not. It's a nice hook that doesn't really have much else around it. But I will say, I don't skip it. I find it to be enjoyable, if slight.
Well, if you skip any song on any album, I lose any respect I have for you. So
I just mean on re-listens. It's perfectly acceptable to skip songs once you know an album if you want to just get, you know, your favorites and stuff. I'm just
fair enough.
Wrong choice.
But like
we have concocted an argument out of nothing.
No, that's very true.
What a James and team moment.
I just find the repetition of the no to be a little, like, okay, and then it just kind of goes into that little like spoken word bit, and I like what's being said here, but it just kind of segues between these two modes, and I'm not really into either mode. So then when you combine the two, the alchemy just doesn't really mix there, and it just kind of comes after a stretch of really good songs. And I don't like I think Big Man Little Dignity is decent, but I also am not like the biggest fan of this song. I like it a little bit more than Liar, but it's got like a little bit more going on, but it's also just one that again, it feels very standard for the band, but everything else here I really love. I think You First and Figure Eight are kind of late track or late album highlights, and my favorite song on here is actually the penultimate song, Crave, which comes right before Thick Skull, which I really enjoy the sentiment of something like Thick Skull. I think that one thing that's understated about, like, or not understated, it's just that maybe they aren't given their due enough, but like there are honestly very, very few people in the music industry I respect more than Hayley Williams. That woman has been put through the ringer. If you know anything about Paramore, if you know anything about her, and the fact that she is still making music that is anywhere up to this level of quality is commendable to anybody. And again, all of these lineup changes and hiatuses, we joke about it, but at the same time, that's not an easy thing to deal with. So I, again, commend them for being able to do this. And Haley, I think, is kind of at the top of her lyrical game. That was kind of why I enjoyed After Laughter as much as I did, is that I found the thematic contributions that she made to that album to be the most evocative that the band had ever been. And I think they are also very much at their like pinnacle at this point in their career. It's just that they don't musically always rise to the occasion, but on songs like Crave or songs like Figure Eight, I really feel her presence and identity as a songwriter that was occasionally even missing from some of her solo stuff that dropped in between this album and the last Paramore album. But overall, it's a very good album. It's just a mite inconsistent for me to truly fall in love with it the way I have with previous Paramore albums.
That inconsistency is compounded by the fact that it is so slight overall.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree.
which I was really going into this thinking that would be a resolute strength of the album,
Me
as
too.
the runtime, the tightness of it, the guess to put a word on it, the death from above 1979, get in, get out nature that I was hoping it would have. And instead, it has that runtime, and it still becomes a little more ponderous and I guess exploratory in places. But I don't think this is the album where exploratory is what would help it. I guess. I mean,
Yeah.
go
There is a
ahead.
little bit of a lack of certainty of musical identity here that every Paramore album before this doesn't have, because every Paramore album before this knows what it is musically, knows what its whole atmosphere is, knows what its whole sound is, and is very good at mining that aesthetic for the length of an album. I mean, it's telling that my favorite Paramore album is by far their longest, just because they're so good at keeping that feeling vital the entire time, and they're so completely just in charge of the aesthetic that they wield essentially, and making that into some really emotionally powerful music. What I'll say is that I think structurally I actually like what This Is Why does. I like its concision, I like its directness, I like basically everything that it's trying to do. I just think ultimately where it is let down is just that, hey, two or three of these songs are just not really as well written and as well composed as they could be. And they belie a sense of maybe a little bit of uncertainty as to whether the band wants to fully commit to what they're doing with the singles on this album. That said, a lot of my favorite songs on the record are not the singles. Despite what I said about This Is Why earlier, which is still probably my favorite song overall, I think that this is a really backloaded album. I actually think that the second half of this record is basically nothing but greatness. I love basically every song from You First onwards. I think is excellent. That whole second half is just, the record completely wins me over
Yeah.
there. It just takes a while to get there, and I will, I guess, stray from the pack with my biggest sort of hot take around this record is I don't really care for the song The Muse that much. It just feels like a little bit musically cluttered and kind of awkward in a way that This Is Why isn't, even if I agree with Jake that they're very thematically similar songs. I like there's a little bit more of a sense of kind of poking fun at herself that Hayley's doing on This Is Why that I like, and I think makes that song even more charming, whereas The News is just, it's trying to have that sense of humor, but it is just a little bit more sort of serious in a way that I don't quite think that they pulled the balance off, and I just think some of the musical ideas on that song just don't work very well. I basically concur on C'est Comme Ça and Big Man Little Dignity. Big Man Little Dignity has some interesting musical ideas in it. I like the little angular guitar part that comes in towards the end. I like the song lyrically as well. It just is a little bit uncertain of its own identity. And in terms of the album's more atmospheric and exploratory moments, I just think a song like Liar pulls that off much more successfully. Figure Eight, I think, along with This Is Why, is the other massive highlight of the album for me. This song is just classic Paramore. I love it. I mean, this is an album that goes great in the car, as every Paramore album should, but especially a song like Figure Eight just completely slaps your tits off in that context, especially. I just love that song so much. And I agree with Crave as well. Crave is like one of those moments where you typically get later on the back half of a Paramore record where Hayley is kind of like stretching her pipes out a little bit more, doing a little bit more stuff that's vocally powerful with a backdrop that's less, frenetic, and just is there to support that performance. And it's a great song. Fantastic Paramore song. Thick Skull ends the record really strongly as well. Has that kind of sort of slightly portentous anxiety that a good album closer for a record like this will often have. And Hayley is the beating heart of Paramore. I mean, she is the heart and soul of what makes them so unique and so captivating and so easy to get emotionally invested in. Like, as you've hinted towards, Jake, like Hayley's gone through so much as well, being in the public eye from a young age as a woman fronting a rock band in a specific genre of rock that is typically dominated by men, and in the 2000s was not just dominated by men but also often dominated by men who were, not the greatest human beings necessarily, and didn't always have the greatest attitudes towards women as well. So the way that she's always conducted herself and always maintained dignity in the face of that whole context that she's grown up in is just amazing. She's never been shy about anything. I think that one of the things that's always, or the thing that's always spoken to how much class and just self-respect Hayley has, is that even when she does diss songs, like when she's essentially writing a diss song against, the ex-band member that essentially blew up and said, "Fuck you all," with Ain't It Fun, she turned that into a song that is an absolute celebration of, just kissing off people like that, and, gently mocking and deriding them without being like, really sort of scathing or brute or, mean-spirited or anything like that. That's why Ain't It Fun is one of the greatest Paramore songs, because it's like, it is just this fuck you song, but it doesn't have this fuck you energy. It has this, don't you think you could be doing better? Don't you think you should, act your age or whatever? I can't do it as well. I can't, describe it as well as she just does with that song. But that's, emblematic of what I've always loved about Hayley, is she just has this spirit where she's able to, be serious or to, make a very effusive point, but never feel as though she's being dour while doing it. She's just got a great sense of humor. She's just got a great charm, and she's just really good at songwriting. And yeah, so This Is Why is a bit of a mixed bag, but I think that it is, for the most part, pretty strong. Like I said, I think that back half really nails the balance. I mean, you have the angular post-punk stuff in songs like You First and Figure Eight. You have the core emotional rock song where Hayley is given the space to really, just sing her fucking heart out on songs like Crave. And you have the perfect Paramore ballad that I always need in the back half of my Paramore albums in a song like Liar. So yeah, the album's grown on me. I still think that its lack of clear identity is maybe one thing that holds it back as an album, more so than just, kind of a set of songs. But I'm glad they're back. I've listened to this album freely, a bunch this week, and I will probably continue listening to it, especially again, like I said, the back half, very easy to put on. So I come away with this broadly quite positive, and just again more and more curious than ever to see how Paramore age. Because if the rate they're going with only like 2 albums every decade, they're going to get old. They're going to need to, and they have with the last couple of albums really stepped into a more mature period. But I'm curious about what that's going to continue to look like for Paramore going forward, because I don't really have any idea from this album what Paramore might continue to do next, what the future might look like for them. It does feel a little bit like a stopgap in some respects. I'm not saying the music sounds this way, but I have always got the impression with this and the last album that Paramore are tired. They've been through a lot and they've had a tumultuous career, and it doesn't strike me like they're a band who finds making music very easy anymore. So maybe that's part of that.
At the same time, though, I think that a lot of Paramore fans, like, of course, when a band you like goes on hiatus, is going to be kind of like, oh no, band I like isn't going to be releasing music. That's difficult. But I think the real desire here is to see what Paramore are like when they actually settle into a creative groove that is not interrupted by a hiatus. It's like, I want to know what a decade looks like where they can release 3 albums without going through some tumultuous shit. Like, what is the through line there? What are we going to be able to see from them? And that's what still makes them an exciting band, is because we really haven't gotten that yet, even though they're a band that has existed in 3 separate decades at this point. So it's like,
it's kind of telling. I think that all the stuff I love the most about the second half of this record is kind of just Paramore doing the hits. It's not really anything all that innovative. And I think when Paramore get past this first half of the record where, they're in that, we have to make the album have its own vision and distinctness, when they get past that and they're not trying to do that anymore, and they're just trying to make really good Paramore songs in the back half of the record, I think that there's less pressure there. And I just find the songs easier to enjoy.
If they want to do that on their next record, that would be refreshing at this point.
But I'm sympathetic to bands. It's hard to do that. It's hard to approach an album cycle.
You can do that now.
You feel this sort of pressure that everything we do has to be something different. I imagine that's a big part of their process.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. But the heart of it is like, take another half a decade if you want. But I want to know what This Is Why Part 2 looks like. The Godfather is a worse film without The Godfather Part 2. So just okay, it's more like, Back to the Future is a worse movie without Back to the Future Part 2.
This is giving me big vibes of like King of Limbs Part 2. When, guys, this was a great taster. We want the rest of the album.
Who has ever said that?
That was what people were saying when King of Limbs came out. They were all like, oh, this is just the first half, guys. Only 8 songs. Nah. This is just part 2 is going to drop.
When's Kendrick going to drop? Nation.
No, well, it's the same thing. People do that every time a band drops a short and underwhelming album. Is they're like, oh, what they're doing, you see, is they're teeing up,
Has a band ever done that?
That's not what I said.
No, I'm not saying it's what you said. I'm just saying it reminded me of that.
The point, I just want something that's iterative for once, in the spirit of All We Know Is Falling into Riot, for instance. And, it's just, part of it is that I'm tired of waiting so long between every album, but mostly it's just that I want to feel the stepping stones of each album a little more. Instead of just a hard jump to something new, because when that happens, you tend to get something that's a little more like this, where it feels leaner and not necessarily the best of ways, although sometimes it is in the best of ways because it just rips.
Well, I don't know. To me, this feels like they're trying to do the stepping stone thing rather than the hard pivot, and it's just that aspect of it, that like not quite committing to anything, seems to be what's kind of leaving people feeling a bit cold. What I kind of want from Paramore is I want them to sort of get in the studio with like, Dave Fridman or someone like that and just make a 35-minute really loud fucking album. That's personally what I want.
Actually make a Death from Above album with Dave Fridman or somebody. That would be bad fucking ass.
There's an At the Drive-In reference on this record. And
don't
do it.
Don't.
Well, and you
don't
can
put
feel
that shit on me, Ricky Bobby.
And you can feel on certain parts of this record, you can feel that they're pulling from that influence. They're not committing to that kind of music, but they're definitely, I would not be surprised if Relationship Command was on in the studio, part of their, mood music while they're kind of working and jamming. And yeah, I would love to see them kind of just full-throated.
Paramore would have the best cover of One Armed Scissor.
Because they're not like
more power.
Because one of the things that was interesting about After Laughter, is that it was kind of the first Paramore album that it was a very successful album and fans loved it. Don't get me wrong, but it was kind of the first album where they weren't really a commercial entity anymore, like they were in their early era. Yeah. So they're kind of freed from that now. I don't think that I imagine they don't feel any pressure to make hits anymore.
Quite literally, is their last record contracted with Atlantic.
Oh, there you go. So I would love to see a little bit more of an embrace.
Ain't It Fun is still on the radio today.
Yeah, but they don't need to make any more of those songs. So that's why I'd like to see them, just do something a little bit more bold. But
make that At the Drive-In record, baby. Come on, let's do it.
Make a fucking doom metal record, man. You know what? Maybe we do need hard pivots. I don't give a shit anymore.
Just have Haley Williams fucking screaming. That's what I want.
Yeah, well, if they're going to do that, they need to do it soon because they're not getting any younger, and after a certain point, you can't do that very convincingly. So,
hold on a minute.
I don't know how old's the dude from Baroness. He's got to be like 45.
Yeah, but he's probably giant, and Haley Williams is a small woman.
She is a tiny lady,
scrawny bald.
She's also 34, so we've got time.
I think this review is probably ready to be wrapped up.
Probably.
I mean, yeah, you're right. We've got time as long as they don't piss about for another 6 years.
All right. Favorite tracks and ratings. Paramore, This Is Why. Jake, you go first.
My favorite track is Crave, then probably Figure 8, and This Is Why. Though there are still some pretty excellent songs on here after that. Least favorite is C'est Comme Ça, and I am feeling a solid 7 out of 10.
Yeah, my 3 favorites. I'll just do the first 3. This Is Why, The News, and Running Out of Time. I think similarly, the last 4 are about as strong. It's just the sort of this C'est Comme Ça you first run that, especially I feel like the momentum. I like Big Man Little Dignity, but I'm probably gonna have to say that that's my least favorite, just for the way it kind of kills the momentum of the album for a bit there. And I think that's more of a structural issue than anything else. But yeah, overall, how to decide the halves? Yeah, I'll give this a 7.5 out of 10.
Alrighty, my 3 favorite tracks are This Is Why, Figure 8. Oh, that song rips, and I will also say Liar, because I that song's really stuck with me. I love the chord choices in that song. I love Haley's vocal performance. Great deep cut. My least favorite is C'est Comme Ça, and the album gets a 6.5 from me. August also listened to it and gave it a 6. So we have an average overall of 6.7 for Paramore's This Is Why. Okay, and now it's time for our second main review of the week, where Jake and I are going to be talking about the new album from Yo La Tengo. This Stupid World is the 17th album from Hoboken, New Jersey-based indie rock legends Yo La Tengo. Yo La Tengo are, of course, a band that we have talked about ad nauseum on this channel, or at the very least, I have. If you haven't already seen it, last year I ranked all 16 of the albums prior to this in a great video that I am very proud of. I'll put a link to it above my head right now. You can go and check it out if you haven't already. Very good video. Gives you a good idea of all the different tangents and places that Yo La Tengo have been in their 40-year career up until this point. And to be perfectly honest with you, while I don't think Yo La Tengo have ever fallen off per se. They certainly, within the last sort of 10 years or so, they've certainly wound down into this very like, bands have a mature period, and then some bands have like, an elderly period where it's like beyond the mature period, and they're just kind of, making very straightforward music, very pretty, very atmospheric, but absolutely not reinventing the wheel in any way, shape, or form. And I like those records. I think that 2015's covers album, stuff like that, there is particularly underrated set of songs, some great covers on there, and a few really creative reimaginings of songs from their 90s era too. Their 2018 album, There's a Riot Going On, was heavily atmospheric and really leaned into the dronier side of things, and led to some of the most beautiful music that they have created in the 2010s completely. And then they had this weird, even dronier experiment with 2020's We Have Amnesia sometimes, which was these 4-minute, like 10 to 15-minute sound collage pieces that they basically designed while in quarantine and kind of ultimately packaged together. But it really hasn't been since 2013's excellent and still quite underrated Fade that Yo La Tengo have released an album that feels like an essential part of their story as a band. And I'm going to be honest with you, I was not expecting this to be it. I had basically kind of consigned myself up until this point that Fade was basically going to be the last record like that, where Yo La Tengo felt particularly energized to do something that was an actual creative statement of some sorts. I had basically resigned myself to believe that Yo La Tengo no longer had any interest in that, and kind of just wanted to cruise through, their twilight years essentially, and just, play shows, make the occasional record of very, backward looking music, and just sort of coast on that forever. And while I don't want to set this up as though This Stupid World is some kind of radical reinvention for Yo La Tengo, or even some kind of dramatic recontextualization of previous sounds, it's a Yo La Tengo album. Recognizably, there's very little on here. Well, there's a couple of things on here that I think will surprise long-time Yo La Tengo listeners. A couple of pieces that see them, taking some of the flirtations with drone music that they've experimented with in the last 10 years even further than they have before in interesting ways. But for the most part, this is very much, it's another Yo La Tengo album. It is distinct in the sense that it is produced more like their 90s records than anything they've put out since that period. And throughout the 2000s, throughout the 2010s, they've worked with various producers, but they've had this arc where with each record they've made since, I think, 2009's Popular Songs, each record they've made, they've worked themselves more and more closer to entirely self-producing. Like, they work with producers, but they've had more of an active hand in the production. And then in the last couple of projects, they have produced entirely on their own, including this. So Yo La Tengo are basically this, they're this 3-person unit. They are frontman and guitarist Ira Kaplan, his wife, drummer, founding member Georgia Hubley, and their longtime bassist James McNew. It is just those 3 and no one else. And it has that sense of intimacy that you would expect from a record that is just made by 3 people as well, but also sees them looking backward and reflecting on their sounds over the years and the sounds that made them most important and popular and well known in the 90s alternative indie rock scene, and revisiting some of those aesthetics, but taking them in a kind of darker direction than they have with any of their records in a very long time. It hasn't really been since 2000s and then Nothing Turned Itself Inside Out that Yo La Tengo have made a record as consistently nocturnal and kind of brooding as This Stupid World is. There are a couple of more conventionally beautiful moments, like the absolutely stunning Georgia sung as Celestine, that definitely feel more of a piece with their later period music. But for the most part, this album it's thickly dark. It's just lathered in this sort of hazy, brooding maelstrom of chaos almost, but it's kind of a controlled chaos, as you would come to expect from Yo La Tengo. Everything's very fuzzed out. Everything is very kind of hazy around the edges. You have this incredibly evocative album cover as well, which is just this pitch black darkness kind of peering in this void, kind of seeping into this, not this suburban landscape with this bright green grass. The color palette's slightly different, but it very much reminds me of the album cover for 1993's Painful, which has the same kind of sort of blurring between sort of darkness and the distant sort of urban space and something close and more intimate. And it also kind of evokes the same sort of eerie suburban vibe of the album cover for 2000s and Then Nothing Turned Itself Inside Out as well. So even before you play the record, you're getting that very evocative sense coming through the material surrounding this project. And yeah, as I've said, the music very much holds true to that. The music feels very much of a piece with that. You know, there's less of a need for these songs to progress anywhere and more contentment for these tracks to kind of exist as a single, almost monotonous groove that basically the band just kind of let breathe and kind of jam out together. And this is a style of music that Yo La Tengo have incorporated into parts of their albums very consistently across their career. I mean, 2009's popular songs ended with 3 10+ minute tracks that essentially did what a lot of this album does, but they put them all at the end after these more conventional Yo La Tengo indie pop songs. Whereas here you're in this jamming, brooding space basically the entire time. And it is a sound that makes sense coming off the back of There's a Riot Going On, which kind of did a similar sort of thing, except it was a little bit more, the whole aesthetic of it was a little bit more sort of synthesizer based and a little bit less kind of moody, I suppose. There's this great fusion of discomfort and beauty that Yo La Tengo are able to mine through their jamming that I think is really effective here, more than it has been for a very, very long time. Jake, I want to turn to you at this point. You are obviously not as well versed through the entirety of Yo La Tengo's discography as I am, though you are, you do like them. I mean, there's a couple of records of theirs I know you love. You very much are able to get on board with a lot of what they do aesthetically. And this record, when I heard it, I thought, this record, I think Jake will fall more into the side of Yo La Tengo that I think Jake will find appealing. So I am curious what your experience was like hearing this for the first time and where your kind of feelings are sitting about now.
Well, I haven't heard all of the Yo La Tengo albums, obviously. I haven't even heard all of their like really, really acclaimed stuff. I mean, I still need to get stuff like Electrapura and I Am Not Afraid of You and I Will Beat Your Ass. I still haven't heard. I will eventually, because I do love this band. Like they have a very high kind of floor and ceiling with me. And Then Nothing Turned Itself Inside Out is probably one of my favorite records of all time. And I've just been listening to a lot more of them as time goes on. They're a band that ages with you particularly very well. And the longer you live with their albums, the more you get to know the sort of many facets and nooks and crannies of their particularly languorous kind of sound, the spaces that they inhabit. And there's something about albums like And Then Nothing Turned Itself Inside Out, which is, it's so ornate, it's so laden with detail. It feels like you're living in an environment as much as you are existing within an album. And I have at least been aware of the fact that, Yo La Tengo hadn't put out an album that was like super essential since something like Fade, just because I had been paying attention to the things that Riley has said about the band. And so I also did not expect this to be a particularly major release from the band. Hell, I mean, I think we were even kind of on the fence as to whether or not we were even going to cover this before we actually heard it. We were just like, oh, there's a new Yo La Tengo album, so might as well put that on the spreadsheet. And then I listened to the album. And I mean, what I didn't expect is for me to just straight up think that this is just as good, if not better, than some of the classic albums from them that I've heard. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that this is just no frills whatsoever. Yo La Tengo are a band that have some tendencies in their more sprawling efforts that sometimes can get away from me. Sometimes some of their jammier stuff, sometimes some of their more repetitive stuff, or sometimes some of their slight stuff, I feel like adds a bit of fat that could be trimmed to some records. I know that that's a lot of the appeal of some of those records for some people. It's not so much so with me. And they also set this album up, I feel like, in a structural way that makes sort of, no matter what you look for in this band, you're going to get it. Because I feel like every song sort of like gives you, like, for instance, Sinatra Drive Breakdown, I feel like gives you that sort of traditional Yo La Tengo vibe, that kind of loping bass line that this band is kind of known for. It's a little bit noisier, it's a little bit jammier. And then immediately afterwards, you have something like Fallout. And this, to me, these two songs right after each other, this is sort of the repetitive, and I don't say that word in like a bad way at all. This is sort of the structure of the album, is that they'll give you a sort of noisier, jammier, traditional, and quality up to standard Yo La Tengo song. And then they kind of do something a bit more curious where they almost strip themselves down to being something that's very minimal, even for them, and just sort of bathe you in this kind of nocturnal, ambient kind of atmosphere. And they don't like relent in terms of their instrumental proficiency. I mean, like everything on here, especially particularly the bass playing, is as, you know, proficient as you would expect to from this band. But this sort of structure of traditional song, atmospheric song, traditional song, atmospheric song, that's pretty much the whole album for me. And consistently, I feel about the same way about all of these, is that I really enjoy the traditional Yo La Tengo album cuts. They feel just like they're off of Painful and Then Nothing. I Can Hear the Heart, all of that kind of stuff. And not to mention the sort of dedication to making it sound that way. This feels like a lost album from that era. It like in every sense of the word. This doesn't feel overly polished. It doesn't feel like they're trying too hard. They perfectly strike the balance. But it's those atmospheric songs that just catapult this album up into the stratosphere for me, because I consistently think that these moments, these more adventurous moments on this album, are some of the best things this band have ever made, and some of my favorite things this band have ever made. I'm talking about Fallout, I'm talking about Acetylene, I'm talking about Apology Letter, I'm talking about The Closer. All of these songs are gorgeous, especially stuff like Acetylene, which is Georgia, I think, on lead vocals. And oh god, like her singing voice has always been very comfortable, very warm, but I really don't think it's ever sounded better than it does on something like Acetylene. It's so warm, it's so romantic, it's so comforting. It gives you everything that you'd want to, that like me, for somebody who loves And Then Nothing, it transports me right back to the sort of 1960s nocturnal just sort of ambiance that album creates, that I find so alluring about that experience. And not to mention, I just think that like Miles Away, the closer on this album,
the most uncompromisingly novel thing here, I think, for Yo La Tengo, because they've done drone music before, but they've never done drone music that's this pillowy, that's this gorgeous, that's this kind of resonant and harmonic. You know, usually their drone music is noise, it's loud, it's guitar feedback that's taken to the limits. But this is just kind of like, so much of that feedback has been kind of piled together that it's just become this kind of homogenous, beautiful sort of drone of reverberance that sounds like nothing else they've put on an album before, at least not in a really long time. Definitely bears the influence of some of the more experimental drone stuff they've done in the more recent years, but you know, combined with the vocal added to this as well, it just feels like a realization of a direction that Yo La Tengo have been experimenting with some of their instrumental stuff, you know, and just, you know, and the vocals on top just gives it this extra level of emotional connectivity that makes it more than just, you know, a drone closer, but an actual song that has adapted that format to, you know, do something different and do something that feels like a fresh spin on what Yo La Tengo do.
Yeah, I want to be real here. I still need to listen to a lot more of this band, and I'll need to do a more comprehensive bit of ranking here, but I think Miles Away might be my favorite Yo La Tengo song. I have listened to this so much this week. It's been a fucking hard ass week. And I put this song on, and it is just so utterly transportative. It's one of those things where you can feel the density of it, even though it is a song that is very like aesthetically kind of light and airy, but at the same time, when you like really hone in and listen to it, you can feel that there is just layer upon layer upon layer of detail. And then the way George's voice is mic'd, just being like really close, it's like behind a bit of a wall of some kind of effect, but it still feels way closer to you than the actual instrumental does, which is so vast. And then you have the vocals that are so intimate, and the way that this contrasting sort of idea sort of collides and then just comes together here, it's fucking beautiful. Maybe my favorite song of the year so far. It has been the one that I have come back to the most and have just felt the most immediate emotional connection to. And you know, that's the thing, is that this is an amazing fucking song. And I think it's so cool that they're doing something as adventurous as this that still builds on what they've been doing in the past decade or so. But the other moments on this album that are great, in my opinion, are still not that far away from it. Again, there's Apology Letter, which I think is gorgeous and acetylene, and Fallout is the real moment on this album where I feel like the first time you hear it, you're just like, oh, this is going to be like a major statement from the band.
Well, I think Fallout's one of the greatest songs that they've ever done. And it's funny because it's one of the greatest songs they've ever done because it sounds like 50 other Yo La Tengo songs. It is the canonical ideal of the Yo La Tengo song. It sounds like, you know, so many of the highlights of so many of their albums before. And, you know, there's even, you know, fans have pointed out that it's basically got the same melody and chord progression as the song Pedal Forward off of Fade. But like, no one cares, you know, that it's what Yo La Tengo have done before, because they're so good at making it feel just so exciting and inviting every single time. And, you know, it's funny because this was the lead single to the album. And I listened to it when it was a single. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this is another Yo La Tengo song. I didn't really process it. But hearing it in the album, and when you have a sort of, when you're situated and you have an idea of what Yo La Tengo are angling at with this particular project, it feels just it feels so inviting and so amazing and so emotional for me as well. The Yo La Tengo record this album reminds me of the most is definitely 1995's Electra Pura, because that's the album. I mean, first of all, I've already said that this album, it feels like what they're doing with the production here, and again, this is entirely self-produced, is trying to evoke the sound of those 90s records. And you know, the 90s record that this reminds me of the most is Electra Pura, because that's the album where you're veering from, you know, brooding sort of krautrock jam to massive shoegaze song that feels like the most intimate, but also the largest thing you've ever heard in your life. And it's just so many of these exciting directions that they're pushing into.
Miles Away is definitely the Slowdive's dagger of this album.
Yeah, well, I mean, Yo La Tengo are always great at closers. Yo La Tengo's closers are one of the most defining attributes as a band. My favorite Yo La Tengo song is a closer. I Heard You Looking off of Painful. Blue Line Swinger off of Electra Pura. Night Falls on Hoboken off of And Then Nothing. The Story of Yo La Tengo off of I'm Not Afraid of You and I'll Beat Your Ass. And The Glitter Is Gone off of Popular Songs. You know, they always have these fantastic, often quite huge closers. And sometimes they'll change up the formula and do like a little more intimate cover song as a closer, like they do on I Can Hear the Heart Beating as One and on Summer Sun. But for the most part, they love to situate this final moment of the album as just this maximum impact hugeness that leaves your ears ringing as the record finishes. And Miles Away is just one of the most striking examples of that they've ever done. It feels a little bit like a grouper song, the way that George's vocals kind of are kind of sort of so ethereally kind of placeless in the mix remind me a lot of that. You have this like skittering, slightly distorted drum machine that I love, that just gives it this kind of dragging feeling that, or just gives this kind of punctuates the sheer wall of fog that the song has, and I love that. It's quite interesting the way that the last two tracks on this record kind of do basically the same thing structurally, but through exploring different aesthetics as well. And I love the way that the record kind of just dissipates in this final stretch as well, with the last three songs especially. It just kind of like, you're right, it kind of alternates in the first half between these kind of like jammier tracks and these sort of more conventionally structured, not pop songs, because they never really go that far here, but just these more sort of balladic Yo La Tengo rock songs. And it's funny how the distinction between these two different types of songs blurs as the record goes on, to the point where the last three songs are really neither of those things. They're kind of just this weird amalgam of noise and sound and vocals, and this sort of continual build that sort of doesn't really feel like it's actually going anywhere, but at the same time has this intensity to it that keeps you sort of hypnotized, basically. And I love that. They're so good at that. And this is definitely one of the most focused Yo La Tengo records, as has already been mentioned. It's on the shorter side as well. I think the only other albums, at least from their Painful and onward period, that are the short. I mean, Fade is also around this runtime as well, but maybe that's the only other one that is. They're just so used to spreading these ideas out and really exploring that space for a longer period of time, which always works. But this feels like something that Stephen Hine said in IndieCast this week that I want to echo is that This Stupid World, I think, might be a great intro record for people who are new to Yo La Tengo, who want to have an idea of what this band are all about, who don't want to get this, who want to get this actually representative picture of what they do, but don't necessarily have the stamina for one of their longer albums. I definitely recommend this. Know that this isn't everything Yo La Tengo do, because if there's one thing that this record is limited in, it's just that it doesn't make room for or really have any of their skills in pop song craft and construction. It's just not really trying to do any of that stuff. A Celestine, again, is the closest that gets. But still, you get this immaculate atmosphere, this incredibly enveloping mood. And again, what Georgia on the drums and James McNew on the bass are doing rhythmically on this album really sustains a lot of these drone tracks as well. I'm a particular fan of tonight's episode, which has this krautrock beat that I really, really love. And this, again, very sticky bass line that you just kind of get stuck into. And I really, really like that. Another great deep cut is Apology Letter as well, which you've already mentioned. Has this again, this incredibly sort of like it's just this 3 a.m. nocturnal feel. It reminds me a little bit of the song Tired Hippo off of And Then Nothing, but also kind of sounds like its own thing entirely too. It's beautifully evocative. I'm a huge fan of the kind of noisy wall of Brain Capers as well, which has these sort of great textures kind of lashing through that noise that I really, really love.
Sets up the end of the record flawlessly.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's actually not a lot to say about this album, but that's
the thing, is that I love this record. I've listened to it like 5, 6, 7 times this week, and like I would be willing to say that I would say that like maybe it's it might be like my third favorite that I've heard from this band. I don't even know, but like, and it is a great intro to the band, but at the same time, it is so elementally simple and focuses so tightly on what it does that there isn't a whole lot to dissect about it,
Well, one thing I will say is that I think that this record kind of has a little bit more, and I say this, relatively speaking, a little bit more going on thematically than Yo La Tengo have had an interest in for a long time. With There's a Riot Going On, their 2018 album, the title kind of hinted at this sort of political undertone. It was this sort of their post-Trump sort of album, but the album never really kind of did much with that, and that was fine because it's not kind of what you really go to them for. But I do think that Ira Kaplan is a really strong and underrated lyricist. Ira and Georgia are both are great at writing lyrics, and this album I think is the first record that they've made in a decent while that feels as though it's going for something thematically unified in the lyrics as well. There's it's not something that's particularly dense or explored in a lot of different ways, but there is this sort of theme of the hugely isolating nature of the world at the moment and the way that we all exist, and also the sense of unification that we're all bound to the world, no matter how stupid it is, no matter how great it is, no matter what it does, we're all kind of bound to it, and we're all kind of bound and imbued with a sense of purpose purely by virtue of living in it. And that's the thing that comes through on the title track here in the lyrics, and that's the thing that comes through on some of the other moments of this album as well. It's gentle textural flavoring more so than the focus of any of these songs, but it adds a sense of unity to the album that I appreciate as well. The vocal performances here, I think the vocals are given a little bit more presence here than they have been on recent Yo La Tengo records, which is interesting to me considering it's such a texturally heavy and jammy album. I concur with your statement about the beauty of Georgia's vocal performance on A Celestine. When I think about all the great Georgia songs, I think about Shadows off of I Can Hear the Heart. I think about Today Is the Day off of Summer Sun. I think about I Feel Like Going Home off of I'm Gonna Beat Your Ass. She's always given great vocal performances, and she's always got this very tender and captivating sort of swanny voice that I love. But she's placed in the mix a little bit louder here. She's given a little bit more prominence, which I really, really appreciate, because it is such a beautiful song, and she's the real heart and soul of it. And I like that that has become a little bit more of a presence on the song. Same with Fallout too. Just an album that really feels as though there's some revitalization that's happened in Yo La Tengo, that they have a little bit more urgency behind what they're doing in creating this. And what I love about that is that I've read interviews surrounding and the press notes surrounding this as well, and nothing that Iris said gives any indication that they were approaching this any differently than they would any other album. They just kind of went in and made music, and it's just kind of purely, as a product of, I guess, wherever they're at, it's come out feeling this connected to their past, but also this revitalized in a way they haven't sounded in a while. So I'm seeing a lot of fans, new and old, but probably more on the new side, calling this one of their best albums. I can absolutely see where they're coming from. It's definitely, I think, probably solidly fall around the middle of my ranking, which is not any way an indictment on it, more just a testament to how many Yo La Tengo albums I love. It's another great one. It's definitely the best that they've made since Fade. I might even narrowly prefer it to that album, although that's also a stunning, stunning record. I think if you're new to Yo La Tengo, or if their music in any way overwhelms you, give this a shot. If you find this a little bit too kind of unfocused or alienating for your tastes, then go and check out something like Painful or I Can Hear the Heart Beating as one. But if this is your bag, then you've got a lot of great stuff to discover still. And if you are coming at this as someone who is a huge fan and is either not listened to this yet or has just kind of started to spend time with it, I'd love to hear what you think as well. I am definitely biased as a Yo La Tengo fan, and Jake is biased purely by the fact that this album just happens to lean into a lot of aesthetics that I know fit into stuff he already loves in music. So we're going to hear your perspectives as well on this one too, because it's a real nice surprise to be this animated by a new Yo La Tengo record, and to see as many people talking about a new Yo La Tengo record.
It got best new music from Pitchfork. Who fucking saw that coming?
Well, I mean, they've always been a critics' darling band. They've always been a band that has
for sure.
Consistently gotten really well reviewed. But even I didn't see that coming either. It felt as though there might even be a place in the culture of indie music for Yo La Tengo now, in a way that seems kind of crazy to think about for how old they are and how past their most culturally relevant music they are. But here we are. Yo La Tengo aged like a fine wine, and this Stupid World is a testament to that. All right, favorite tracks and ratings for this album. I'll go first this time. My three favorite songs are Fallout, A Celestine, and we might even have the same picks here. Fallout, A Celestine, and Miles Away. Just three incredible songs. The album really never drops the ball, though, for me. Least favorite, I guess if I had to pick one, I'd say Until It Happens, but it's fairly well positioned in the middle of the record. It doesn't do anything that I don't enjoy. It just sort of is one of the least compelling moments atmospherically, I suppose, but it's still really, really good. Really strong album. Definitely deserves an 8 from me.
My three favorite tracks on here, I'm going to say Miles Away, A Celestine, and I'm going to shout out Apology Letter. I adore that song, and I'll say that I dig Until It Happens pretty well. I'd say that my least favorite track on here is probably the title track, honestly. I really feel like structurally speaking, it sets up the end of the record well, but like as a piece of music in and of itself, it's probably the least compelling thing here, but I still think it's a pretty great song, honestly. So I say so very not really with my foot firmly on that particular tile. So I'm gonna say that I'll give this album an 8 out of 10 as well.
Plus, August has also listened to this. August gave it a 6 out of 10, which means we have an average overall of 7.3 for Yo La Tengo's This Stupid World. Let us know what you think of either of the albums we discussed today. Paramore's This Is Why and Yo La Tengo's This Stupid World in the comments below. A lot of this week, so let us know what you think of that. Trying to do something there. Failed miserably. Want to hear what you think of these albums. Do you think that they stand up to the band's best work? Do you disagree with us? Do you vary from us on any of the points that we've made? If you do, want to hear from you. If you agree, want to hear from you too, because who doesn't love being right? And on that note, if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed these reviews, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel if you have not already. Both those things help us out a lot. If you want to go above and beyond and support us, you can hit the join button on our YouTube page for just $1 a month. Become a member of the Jams D family. Get your name in the title call of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to talk about, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, though, folks, until next time, rock over London, rock on Chicago, State Farm. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.